Hey, it's Jordan. I'm here with Professor Rob Fischer of Case Western University in Ohio, and you are one of the authors on a really, I thought, alarming study that shows Cuyahoga County, which Cleveland is in, has really high lead levels, which shocked me because it's actually declining. So you would think that's good, but even while the lead levels in children are declining, they're still extremely high. Can you kind of give us the main takeaways from your study?
Yes, I'd be glad to. The, I guess the big picture is yes, we've seen the same declines in our community, really, over the last 15 years. Um, but still, I think before we take a victory lap about beating lead, we need to think about those that are still have continuing risk uh, to it. So in Cleveland, we see that about 17% of Cleveland children are exposed in a year, about 11% in the county total. Uh, and then the focus of our studies recently were to look at Cleveland kindergartners and take a little different approach to it, to ask the question, how many of them have been exposed to lead prior to kindergarten? So it's like lifetime prevalence. And there we find that just over a quarter of all kindergartners over a 3-year period had a documented lead exposure above five micrograms per deciliter prior to arriving at kindergarten.
And I mean, the context, Cleveland was actually dead last in 2017. I don't know about 2018, but 2017 dead last in childhood poverty nationwide. It beat Detroit just by a little hair. So you have really pervasive childhood poverty, poverty in general. It's 50%, I believe, by the census data, African American. Very. I mean, like you see in Detroit and Flint and Milwaukee and many other cities,
Right.
not a lot of opportunity. So, what's obviously there's no definitive answer, but what's the main culprit? Is it lead paint, old infrastructure? We see water systems producing lead around the country.
Well, obviously, the tail is in the individual investigations of each child's exposure, but what we know is the lion's share dominant cause here is lead paint in homes, and I think it that poverty statistic that you cite. Lead exposure is a hazard of living in poverty because so many of those exposures are occurring to in families that are renting in low quality housing. They're not maintained sufficiently by landlords, and the oversight has been lax. So those it's a kind of a multi-factor issue that's resulting in this exposure.
And in addition to lead paint, I mean, I covered the lead problem and, frankly, crisis in Indiana, in East Chicago, where low income housing was basically built on a lead smelting plant. We see in other areas of high industrialization, corporate polluters, this kinds of things. Is this a highly industrialized area, or it's just you have a lot of old housing stock?
Well, certainly historically there were more of those kind of treatment and industrial sites in the city proper, which then housing came in. A lot of this housing dates to the 20s, 30s. So it's, if anything, we should not forget the risk of the soil around the homes where children are playing, both prior contamination, but also from the homes themselves losing paint into the ground surface.
Right. And, you kind of look at Medicaid, I believe. There's provisions that allows that for children, I think ages 1, 2, 3, can be tested for lead. But your research study found that only about 50% were tested, I think from 2012 to recently.
Yes, so the by policy the standard is that children should be tested around age 1 and around age 2 if they're on Medicaid, and we found that about half, looking at several years of children, about half were getting tested at age 1, a third at age 2, and so in total, those that meet the policy, about 20% of children are being tested according to that standard.
And let me ask you, I mean, it's obviously a cyclical type of thing because you have high lead. So then as a result of high lead, research has shown you could have behavioral problems that lead to, you know, juvenile crime, these kinds of things. You also have, you know, more learning disabilities, which then people don't become productive members of the economy because they're struggling in their education, and it leads to more dropouts, things like that. So essentially, it's you're born into the poverty, by extension, born into this lead exposure, and it's hard to become a normal, productive member of society to get out of that poverty.
Yeah, it's a potentially vicious cycle that's being set up with the lead exposure, and I don't want to discount the other implications of living in poverty, just the low resource family. I mean, certainly children that can have a high lead exposure, but if they're in a supportive, resourced environment, they can overcome that adversity. But when now it's layered on top of some family issues, single parenthood, the low quality housing, aside from the lead, is risky. Low resource neighborhoods, it's very risky for these children. And your point about, downstream outcomes, if you think of it as now in every setting where the child goes, they might be displaying these behaviors that either make them seem like they're hard to work with or challenging in some way. It presents now that those settings have to deal with the behavior. They're not understanding it as an implication from a lead exposure that was not the child's fault. They're seeing oppositional, dysfunctional behavior, and they're going to respond to that in the ways that we can anticipate.
And obviously, you focused on Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, but
right.
Cleveland's not the only city with this lead exposure. I mean, Detroit, which was right after Cleveland in the 2017 childhood poverty rankings, they just shut down all of their water fountains in the public schools because they found high lead levels. So it seems to me there's obviously a nationwide problem. Flint was, the one that got headlines, which I've covered a lot. But you have all this old housing stock, old infrastructure. Frankly, as I've kind of reported, a lot of these water utilities kind of game the system in the way they test. So for people watching, I mean, they might not live in Cleveland, but there's a lot of high lead in children going on all over this country.
Yeah, I mean, there is, since they, if you look at the national data from the NHANES research, the 5% of kids who have the highest exposures has been getting smaller, and that led to a change in the standard from 10 micrograms to 5 micrograms. But that alone, we're still talking about tens of thousands of children being impacted by lead, and the concern about, it's too big of a problem to solve because of the cost is totally flying in the face of what we know to be the potential civic payoff of averting this up front.
Right, but also what's the cost? What's the bigger cost down the road? Not just in human, but in healthcare needs for these children when they become adults.
Yes, the whole social safety net and civic life.
Now, I'm assuming you've had a little bit of my experience, because sometimes as a journalist covering these issues, it's like reporting into a cave, if it's not Trump's tweets or Russia and those kinds of things, you would think this would be like banner news. But I've found both locally and on the national level, the media doesn't seem to see much urgency in this. I think with Flint, the only reason it originally had urgency is you kind of just saw things right away, like rashes and, images. What's been your experience? Obviously, the study recently came out, but are lawmakers taking this seriously? John Kasich just left the governorship. I'm assuming he was familiar with some of this while he was governor. What's been the response there?
Well, I mean, it is a dramatically an urban center problem where the low quality housing is. So it's you run the risk of it being seen as isolated in some way. I think the reception, there's been an increasing awareness over time among partners about, the need to do better on this front. Yeah, I think there was almost a feeling like we had beat this. So some of the response to these data are like, what? Lead is still this high? We thought we were doing so much better. We thought we'd averted this. So reminding people about the severity of it is a concern. And then, I've made presentations to bodies that, the backlash is pretty, the standard line is, well, in the 70s, we were all kind of soaked in lead and we came out fine. So is this really as big a problem as you're saying? And, I find that a very troubling argument that we were so bad before, and that so being this bad is okay. I just don't think that's acceptable, because it has a huge disproportionate impact, particularly on African American families and the most disadvantaged families in our community. And it's one more thing we're allowing to happen to them, while at the same time we're doing other things like investing in high quality early care and education and preschool as a way to remedy this. But we could be stopping some of the problem at its source.
Right. And not that this makes a major difference, but those people saying that in the 1970s might have been from a white family where, both parents didn't have to work, or they had both parents and they didn't eat, they ate 3 meals a day and, healthy nutrition. So a
lot of factors, yeah, that could have made it a non-issue for them.
Right. So what are, I've noticed in Flint and East Chicago and other areas I went, it's not that parents of these children don't want to protect their children, but they themselves, aren't the most up on what's going on. Sometimes they lack education. Sometimes, these are the most marginalized people in the country, and also they're working 2 to 3 jobs. So if it's somebody watching from Detroit or Cleveland or wherever, obviously if their kids have already been, exposed to this, in some respects the damage is done. But how do they A, find out, and B, what do they do to protect their kids? Because there's people watching that might have 1-year-olds or 2-year-olds or in an inner city.
Right. Parents are the first line of defense for this, but as you say, they might be compromised in a number of ways. What I've seen is we've moved the education of parents earlier and earlier, at the hospital as they're getting ready to go home, now prenatally, or when they're considering starting a family, to make sure that this is on their agenda. They're thinking about, unfortunately, it's a large number of things to think about. And housing, if they have limited housing options, what are we telling them to do? Aside from get the environment tested, if it tests positive, what is the strategy if their only other options are similarly low quality, low cost housing? So, but primary care physicians, pediatricians have to do more, I think, to facilitate parents thinking about this early and get the testing done. The test is too late. It's after the damage is done, but it's the only way to really get one reading on whether risk has already had the impact.
And you brought this up earlier, but I think it plays a major part. It's not like landlords who are renting apartment units out or houses out are doing thorough testing for, lead or lead in the soil or dust or whatever. And as far as I know, there's not a lot of oversight of that. I remember in East Chicago, which had in that one housing complex, they found lead levels in the soil like 200 times the limit. the landlords were never testing anything, and they were certainly they were actively moving people in after it became a national story, not even mentioning there's high lead levels inside these units and outside. So is there any oversight on the housing part of it to basically tell renters or homeowners what's in the house, what's in the soil, how old are the pipes, what, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we've had in Cleveland, we've had a rental registry for many years, but it never had any requirement related to lead testing. So that's the latest initiative, is to be more exert more pressure on landlords to. I mean, the dream would be, if you're going to rent to families with children, you have to be certified lead safe in your environment. We're not there yet. We've sent a delegation to Rochester, New York, because they've had dramatic success on getting systems to work together to produce a dramatic drop in lead exposure of children. So we're trying to figure out what will work here in Cleveland to do this. I think you have to consider, and what we've heard is, well, what are the rights of landlords versus the rights of children? I mean, that's what we seem to be balancing, because if we don't let families live in these houses, what happens to those landlords? What happens to their income? And I think that's a false trade-off here. We have, because and it's unwinnable. I mean, just as an example, I mean, in Cleveland, the health department was really unwilling to placard properties that had not complied with lead removal and lead abatement procedures until just about a year ago or so. And so that was standard practice in other parts of the state, but we were reluctant to do it. And at a minimum, placarding of the home saying this is a risk to children would seem to make the most sense, but we were worried about the impact on the landlords.
And last question. I mean, this is not as much about lead, but about the situation you're seeing around the country. I think gentrification plays a big part of this. Obviously, gentrification didn't create the lead paint, but gentrification is happening where politicians use these, very cuddly words, economic development and redevelopment, and essentially in Detroit and Cleveland and many other places, they focus on about 2 to 3 miles downtown, beautifying it, putting in Whole Foods, putting in high-rise apartment complexes, and they leave the rest of the cities to rot. I mean, if you go to Detroit and you hear from the media reinforce, oh, Detroit's coming back. Yeah, 10 blocks in Detroit are looking very nicely, but drive around the rest of Detroit. So it seems to me that I'm not asking you to get too political, but it seems to me our politicians are really, really focusing on, dressing up and beautifying, certain parts of a city or county and leaving other parts to kind of fend for themselves.
Yeah, I guess I'll give them not a pass, but I'll say, I can understand a rationale where, you don't have enough resources to strengthen the whole community. So you're going to try to strengthen parts that will then hopefully have a bleed over effect into neighboring communities. I understand that argument, but too many times we invest with the idea of attracting new residents almost at the expense of the quality of life of current residents, and displacement and just non-inclusion of those residents. Historically, the most disadvantaged families, dominantly families of color, they're the ones who are often most skeptical, and rightly so, of something called economic development.
Right. Thank you, Professor Robert Fischer from Case Western Reserve University. Look forward to seeing, hopefully, these numbers shrinking further, but let's see if this gets a little more attention, because obviously, you're not really seeing, generally speaking, the CNNs of the world and these kinds of news networks covering things like this. So it's really up to researchers and local water and environmental and civil rights groups to make us think about this.
No, you're exactly right, Jordan. And I would just add that we're not done here. We're over this coming year we're using integrated data to look at lead exposed children and follow them into through their grades in school, into the juvenile courts, into early adulthood, to see if we can document what the differential impact has been on them due to their lead exposure, controlling for all those other things that matter. So we hope to have a report late this year that will put some probably some pretty tough numbers to this about what it's costing both the individual children and their families, but our community.
Great. Then we'll have to stay in touch. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Jordan.